Well, Director, thank you for having me today. Over the last few days, we've seen reports of immigrants that are showing up at churches across the valley, across the state of Arizona. And we wanted to talk to you a little bit about that to understand what is happening. Who are these people? So I guess the first thing that I want to just ask you right off the bat, how many family units have been released by ICE and turned over to churches in the community?
Sure. Well, let me first just describe that this happens every day across the southwest border and in Arizona prior to the last few days of media reporting. However, the volume has increased, and that volume has increased because CBP is apprehending much larger numbers than previous weeks and months and are having significant capacity issues at their stations. So normally, we were releasing somewhere between 100 and 120 family unit members. That's total number of people throughout the entire state of Arizona, whether that's in Yuma, Tucson, or locally here in Phoenix. Since Sunday, we've increased those numbers to somewhere between 200 and 250 total family members throughout the state. And so what's happened is those NGOs that we've worked with in the past, they've kind of stepped up their assistance on the volume that they've been able to provide more shelter space and more resources to get people that ICE is releasing on an ankle bracelet in terms of conditions versus sending them to a family residential center. So some people are still being sent to our family residential centers to be detained to go through proceedings, but there's only a certain amount of intake that they can take daily. So when there is no intake, when someone we deem not to be a threat, an immediate threat to the public, we make those determinations to place them on a condition of release, which is wearing an ankle bracelet, checking in with ERO office at their final destination, and attending all court hearings.
Well, you mentioned that at first, the volume of people that were being released was roughly about 100 or so. Over what period of time are we talking about?
The greater volume started on Sunday, but if you're saying how many is this happening, this has been happening for the past several years. Some days there could be only 20 people released. Some days there could be 100. It just depends on what's really being apprehended on the borders of Arizona.
So where were these people before? Even just prior to the weekend where we saw large groups of people being released. Were they housed at a detention center? Where were they before they were placed on a bus, and then sent over to churches across the state?
These people were in CBP custody. So they were either at a Border Patrol station or at a port of entry, waiting to be transferred to ICE.
Walk me through the process. So an immigrant shows up at the border, whether it's a port of entry or in between ports. What happens when they show up and they want asylum?
In that scenario, and let me just be clear, not every person that's being arrested as a family unit is claiming asylum. But in that scenario, if someone comes across the border and is apprehended by CBP, whether at a POE, at a port of entry, or in between those, they make that claim to a Border Patrol agent. That Border Patrol agent will document that they are claiming fear. Depending on how they're processed, they will either next be interviewed by an asylum officer, which is not an officer within ICE. It's within Citizenship and Immigration Services. That officer will make a finding of, is their claim credible? And that claim is just verbal. If it is, they're issued a different document where they see an immigration judge. But ultimately, in asylum proceedings, an immigration judge is the final determination whether someone gets asylum or not. So what we see in this process is about 80 to 90% of asylum officers grant that they have a positive finding, which makes them to the next level to an immigration judge. When it gets to the immigration judge, nationally we see about 20 to 25% approval rate. So 75 to 80% are never granted asylum. When that happens, a judge orders them deported, and then ICE affects that deportation.
The groups of people, the family units that are showing up at these churches, are some of them not asylum seekers?
Yes, some are coming to the United States and just came illegally. Some may be claiming asylum. I won't get into the specific numbers, but there is a mix.
So I think a lot of people understand that at least those who are asylum seekers go through a process, as you just explained, if they're claiming asylum, and then they are released pending maybe a court hearing and with monitoring. But what about those who may not be seeking asylum? What would be some circumstances in which they are still released from custody?
Well, every person that is either detained or released, we look at the totality of the case. So it's a case-by-case basis. It doesn't necessarily matter to us if they're claiming asylum or not. It's what is their immigration history? What is their criminal history? Do they have ties to the United States? Do they have a sponsor, somewhere to live? Do they have a way to get there? So we look at a bunch of different factors to determine whether they're even eligible to be released on an ankle bracelet to begin with.
Are the majority of these groups of people that we've seen recently asylum seekers?
I don't have those numbers.
Now, once they go to this process and they're apprehended, they go through the court system, how long are you able to keep them in custody before you actually have to release them? Is there some sort of limit that you're bound by as an agency that you then, after a certain amount of days, you have to release them?
Yeah, so the interpretation of the Flores Agreement, which bounds our agency to not have someone stay in custody over 20 days. So
is that anybody in custody or particularly?
As a family unit.
Okay.
So let me first describe as a family unit. We describe by statute that is a mother or father with a child under 18 or a legal guardian. It's mostly a mother or parent, at least that's the claim being made. Sometimes they have birth certificates, oftentimes they don't. Sometimes it's an aunt or an uncle or a family friend. If it's a grandparent with a child, an uncle with a child, that does not qualify as a family unit the way ICE interprets the law. But if they are a family unit, if they are a mother and father with a child under 18, and they end up being sent to a family residential center, which is in Dilley, Texas, in Karnes, Texas, and also in Berks, Pennsylvania. We have 3 locations where people can be sent to go through proceedings.
None in Arizona?
None in Arizona. So if they go to that process, that's where they can't remain within DHS custody longer than 20 days. And often they're only in custody 12 to 13 days, and they're released to continue their proceedings because of that factor. So people know that, smugglers know that, they take advantage of it. That's why there is most likely a big draw to the United States of family units or even people acting as family units because the consequence isn't really there. Even if you get to a point where you're released from custody for 2 or 3 years, at that final hearing when you see an immigration judge, you may not show up because you may feel like your claim is not going to be approved. And then ICE is dedicating resources to look for those individuals to arrest and ultimately repatriate. So 2% of all family units that are apprehended ultimately get repatriated. So that means 98% are going through proceedings or are actively looking for them right now. That's causing a big draw and a big reason why ICE isn't necessarily expanding family residential centers because we are currently under this 20-day limit. So until that Flores settlement can be changed or congressional laws are passed that we don't have to abide by that, then we would probably see an expansion and probably less of a draw of a family that's coming across not just the Arizona borders, but the entire southwest border.
Many people have asked me, as we tell these stories of the large groups of people that are showing up at churches and then released by ICE, many people ask me, why can't a lot of these families who, as far as we know, are coming from Central America, there's been an increase in numbers reported by the Border Patrol. Would you agree that that's an area, not necessarily from Mexico that are coming, but they're coming from Central America?
Yes, I would say on the Arizona borders, probably about 85% of them come from the country of Guatemala.
Guatemala alone?
Yes.
And so a lot of people ask me, why can't the Central Americans instead be deported and find another way to legally ask for asylum? Are you able to say, is it easy to simply deport somebody, or are you bound by particular rules to accept any claim of asylum?
Well, let's be clear on ICE's role in this. We're not the apprehending agency. They're being apprehended by CBP on the border or at the port of entry. ICE is CBP is requesting from ICE to transfer them to our custody to make a determination of should they be detained or should they be placed on some type of alternative to detention? So that's kind of ICE's role with regards to family units. So what DHS as an agency suggests is if you are coming as an asylum seeker, that you claim asylum in the first safe country you enter. And if you're transiting through Mexico, you can claim asylum in Mexico. If you're in Mexico trying to claim asylum in the United States, then you should present yourself at a port of entry and not cross the borders in between. You can actually make that claim to a CBP officer at a port of entry.
What's your guess as to why they're not doing it in Mexico and they're crossing yet another country just to make it to the U.S.?
I mean, I can't say a guess. I can just say that I've talked to specific family units that have crossed the border recently in Arizona, and they're telling me, they were both from Guatemala, that on the news in Guatemala, they're saying that you can get a work permit if you're a family, if you're coming with your child, and that you're going to be released. So that's what, at least they're telling me, that's on the news down there. I'm sure smugglers are taking advantage of that these individuals pay smugglers to get to the border, where traditionally people would not give themselves up to a Border Patrol agent or to an officer at a port of entry. They would try to evade arrest. Now they're simply giving themselves up because of the statistic that I gave you. 98% of family units are being released. That's a massive draw. The way we have our system right now, of course, it's going to continue until that changes.
Do you find yourself in a position where even if you're within that time limit from the Flores agreement, where you simply don't have enough capacity to even hold them and have to release them sooner than the time?
I think that we have the ability to build capacity, but under those constraints, why would we invest more money and infrastructure into something that is not going to get someone through the due process? Those family residential centers, I actually stood up when I was in the same position in San Antonio. They weren't built for how they're being used now. They were built to hold someone there until their case was adjudicated by an immigration judge. And then at that point, if a judge granted relief, that could be asylum or other type of relief, they would be released. If they were ordered deported by an immigration judge, then they would be repatriated from there, just like our adult facilities, for instance, like in Florence and Eloy, how they operate. That was the intention of those facilities being built. But now with different interpretations of the Flores settlement, that's not actually possible. So until DHS can overcome those kind of requirements and guidelines, it doesn't make sense to actually build more capacity if we're going to be doing the same thing.
So are you at capacity, say daily?
It fluctuates, but I'm not actually responsible for those facilities now being in Arizona. So we take requests daily. We send people there daily, but it's on a limited number.
So you're tasked with transporting them from once they're being released from detention, is that correct?
Well, task is a word I wouldn't use, and it depends on really what your question is. So the responsibility of ICE is if we are transporting someone for repatriation or to a family residential center, then yes, ICE makes that transportation. If they are at a Border Patrol station or a port of entry, there's sometimes we actually go to those places and pick up and bring them back to be processed. There's also times when CBP transports them to ICE offices. So when we do that, it's because we're assisting our partners, not because it's our obligation to do so. But we all are one Department of Homeland Security and have similar missions. Excuse me. So when it's transporting to a bus station or an airport, that's also something that we're not obligated to do, but we have done in the past, where we see these capacity issues, and this all stemmed in Yuma, Arizona, because there were more people being apprehended that could be released to ICE in a single day. So the numbers kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger, is when we really asked for NGO assistance throughout the communities of Yuma, Tucson, and Phoenix. And those NGOs have really stepped up and provided more shelter space and the ability to provide the transportation to either Greyhound or to the airport. And they're doing that, ensuring that these people get to their final destination.
Over recent days, all across Arizona, we have seen images, and we actually, KTAR News was at several of the churches recently, Monday and Tuesday, and particularly in Phoenix, where dozens of immigrants got off the bus, families, kids, little kids, sometimes babies, their parents. You know, they had duffel bags and backpacks, and they walked into a church that was already set up to receive them with food, with blankets and clothing. Those buses, are these NGOs and non-governmental organizations that you work with, or is that coming from ICE that transports them directly to, say, the churches?
Well, I wasn't there, so I'm not sure. It could be either. Some NGOs have chartered some transportation. Most likely, they were our buses. I've seen at least one of your clips, and I could identify those as ICE buses that people were brought here from Yuma or Tucson Border Patrol stations. They were processed with putting an ankle bracelet on. They were given their conditions of release and told to report to an ERO office in a certain amount of days. And then they were transported to the shelter because we've already made those arrangements, and those numbers have already been worked with that group that, hey, we can receive 50 family members today at this time, and we coordinate that transportation to that shelter.
But where are they going? So once they end up at, say, a church, and some of them do have, we saw the ankle monitors, where can they freely roam around the country, and where are those court hearings scheduled? Is it here in Phoenix? Because what if somebody has family members, say, in the East Coast, but their hearing is here in Phoenix? Is that something, do you know where they're going?
We know where they're going, where they tell us they're going. They give us an address that we verify, and that's where their court dates are sent to that address. So generally, I would say over 95% of the people are not staying in the state of Arizona. Most of them are going east of Arizona and generally to the East Coast, but different states throughout the United States. So based on what they tell us at processing, that's where we send their documents, and that's also where we tell them to report to an ERO office within 7 to 10 days to check in as a measure of complying with their release. If they don't do that, if they don't check in, if they cut that ankle bracelet, they're subject to arrest and being detained. They're also subject to federal prosecution for destruction of government property or hindering their removal efforts. So those are possibilities which they're explained to them at the time that they sign the paperwork that they're going to be released.
But if they do skip out on a court date, or they do cut off their ankle monitor, do you have the resources to go after them, and will you go after them?
Well, it depends on where they cut their bracelet off. Generally speaking, they're not cutting them off in the state of Arizona. When they do, they might cut them off in North Carolina. I don't operate North Carolina, so I can't, excuse me, I can't say that they have the resources or not. I can tell you that we have employees here that is their main job, that if an ankle bracelet is cut off, it sends an alert to emails, and it gives us a GPS location of where that bracelet was cut off, and my officers respond to that location to look for the individuals and to recover the device.
That's a lot more work for you and your agents in your office.
Yes, it is.
Do you have the resources to handle large volumes, as we're seeing large volumes of people being released?
We are keeping up with what is coming today. If it gets worse, I don't know. I think our biggest issue is are we going to continue to have NGO support that can sustain this many people being dropped off at their faith-based organizations, and can they sustain helping them transporting to airports and bus stations and providing shelter for 1 or 2 days?
Let's talk about those NGOs and then the relationship that you have with these groups. So do you just pick up the phone and say, hey, I have a group of people that are being released? Do they just respond, or what's the process for you to get them involved to help with this process?
So again, we've been involved with many of these groups for several years. So this is nothing new. What's new is the volume. So before it may have been, we're going to send you 50 people every Wednesday. And now it may be, we're going to send you 50 people every day, right? So it depends on what they're able to accept and sustain. And so we have point of contacts with these NGOs. They have our information, and we're in communication with them every day on what they can kind of take, if they can take more family units for the day or in 2 days. And they're really doing that based on their volunteer support that are helping kind of provide the food, the shelter, the communication, and also when people go to a bus station, say 20 people go to a bus, now maybe they have room to house 20 more. So it's a constant dialogue between us and the NGOs that are assisting.
You don't ultimately call a church or a faith-based organization. You go through the NGOs to help you coordinate that?
Well, these NGOs are generally faith-based organizations. We have a point of contact with 2 or 3, and they talk to all of their other partners. So that's kind of how it operates.
We talked about the possibility of, your agents going after those who may cut off their anchor monitors. But what about those that will likely not or ever show up to a court hearing? Are you confident that a lot of people would even show up? Do you see people show up?
It depends on the area they're going. So we track when someone doesn't show up, and then they become a fugitive. And then they become on a docket that we look for them for arrest. Again, explaining that the population that is coming over the borders in Arizona aren't staying here. I can't comment on that because we don't see a lot of it. They might end up in Florida, New York. And those offices would have to say, well, yes, I've had 100 people cut off their bracelet or 0. I can't respond to that. I can only tell you what happens in Arizona. Some people cut their bracelets here. It's not a lot. And it's generally not a family unit. It's someone that was released for whatever reason, and their court hearing was come up and they cut it off. And then we respond and and we've arrested people that have cut off their bracelets and recovered those devices. We're also still actively looking for people that cut their bracelet and we haven't been able to find yet.
For those who are seeking asylum and end up being released, whether they're a family unit or not, what kind of vetting process do they go to make sure that if they are released, they're not a danger to society?
Well, everyone goes through the same process. Again, it doesn't matter if you're claiming asylum or not. You're being fingerprinted. You're going through all of the FBI and DHS databases to determine if you've been arrested before, if you've been charged or convicted with the crime here in the United States. And even in some countries, we find people that are wanted in, say, Guatemala for homicide. And we have that information. So everyone, whether you're a family or a single adult crossing, goes through the exact same process. There's no different process just because you're a family unit.
But if nothing shows up on a fingerprinting or a report from another agency that says this person is wanted for X crime, there is a possibility that somebody could be released and still be a danger to society.
Well, we don't have a crystal ball. When we're at capacity issues, we don't release known threats to society. That doesn't mean that because you've never committed a crime or you don't come up on any database doesn't mean you're not going to get behind the wheel tomorrow, drive drunk and crash and kill others in an automobile accident. I can't predict that. And we take that into consideration that you haven't committed a crime, that you have these resources, but I can't verify that you're never going to commit a crime. Nobody can.
President Trump has raised fears of MS-13 gang members coming over to the border and claiming asylum and disguising themselves as asylum seekers. Are you able to ensure that none of the people that are being released are members of a gang like Mara Salvatrucha, who's just in history is so violent, let alone it's a gang, that none of these people that are being released are members of the MS-13?
I'm not aware of anyone being released that's a member of MS-13. If we're made aware of that, and we have very good training to recognize gang members by several different factors that I'm not going to go into publicly, and communication with other countries, that we're not aware that we released even one MS-13 member or any gang member for that matter.
So we have a large volume of people coming over to the border. We have detention centers that are possibly at capacity. We have a Flora settlement that's keeping you from housing them longer. And there's a process of releasing people when a judge says they should be released. What is the solution to be able to stop the flow of people coming or to stop the flow of people that are being released into the community that, for all intents and purposes, don't have legal status? They have a court date and they have yet to go through an immigration procedure, if you will. What would you say is the process, the solution?
The solution is really up to Congress to kind of enact a law that doesn't have to comply with the forest settlement, that changes the way that kind of these individuals and smugglers have found the loophole into exploiting coming across the border with a child. And I told you in some instances it's not their child. It could be a family friend or a kid that you know, they're trying to get to their parent and they're disguising themselves as their mom or dad. And we've seen that in many circumstances. So the true fix it lies with Congress to kind of fix that loophole that we've brought to light.
When I spoke to Border Patrol this week in Yuma, you know, they were saying we have agents that are at the desert and they're seeing people crossing over the, you know, the wall, and some areas don't have any barriers. So we're seeing a lot more people. Do you think that a larger barrier will prevent the flow of people to come in that will eventually end up in your office to be processed?
I can't speak to the operations of the Border Patrol and how they describe their deterrence, so I'd leave that and defer that to the Border Patrol to answer.
Talk about the dangerous journey. So it's dangerous because it's a desert. People are crossing from Guatemala all the way to the U.S., but what about the dangers to the agents who are having to, at some instances, go after those who skip out on their court hearings, skip out on their ankle monitors? Does it put your ICE agents in danger by having to go after people that, for many, they feel shouldn't be here in the first place?
Well, we have officers that are well trained, and yes, there's a danger element in the work they do. What this is doing is increasing the workload. So right now, you know, I have fugitive operations teams that go out every single day in the state of Arizona, prioritizing criminals first, people that have been convicted of crimes in the United States, that have maybe snuck across the border after being deported, and we target those individuals first. But if we keep adding more and more people to fugitive backlogs, that's more and more work. When we looking for people and going into houses, that's unknown. Whether it's a criminal or a non-criminal, things can happen, people can be there. People don't want to be arrested. People don't want to be repatriated. They came here for a reason. So the danger elements there, assaults on police officers are skyrocketing, and we're seeing that in all populations, not just specifically the criminals. So what it's really doing is increasing the workload of ICE.
Are we going to see more buses pull up at churches, hundreds more people being released in the next few days?
There likely will be more buses as long as there are shelters and as long as CBP is arresting people at the border. Again, I don't have the crystal ball. I don't know if the numbers are going to continue or slow down. My guess that they will probably continue to increase.
What is your message to Valley residents, you know, here in Phoenix, but also across the state of Arizona, of the release of these family units and other immigrants? You know, a lot of people are worried, and they call in and they tell us, you know, how do we know that we're not going to be in danger? What is your message as the director of ICE field operations here in Phoenix, that you're doing your job, and this is kind of how it is right now?
Right. Again, this is nothing new. We've been doing this for several years. It's maybe coming more to light in the media, what we've been doing. It's just a higher volume than what we're used to. We still do have the same process, that we didn't eliminate any process of vetting individuals that we feel are a threat, that people that are being released to the shelters are accompanied with children. They're not necessarily staying in Arizona. Like, again, 95% of them are not. If they are staying in Arizona, someone from Arizona would probably come to our office and pick them up if they're being released, versus ever having to go to a shelter. I mean, ICE is doing what they can. We are at, you know, again, not an Arizona issue. It's a southwest border issue. This is happening in all 4 states. It's just that it's coming to light more in Arizona today versus the entire southwest border. Now, I can tell you the biggest amount of family units coming over across the border is still in South Texas. They still have probably double the amount that come over in Arizona. And the difference there is there's family residential centers that they're going to, but ultimately they're probably getting released into the communities after, again, 12 to 13 days.
And at the end of the day, what do you tell your superiors and the higher-ups in Washington, D.C., and on the rest of the Homeland Security that you have to report to of what you're seeing, these large volumes, and are you getting the help that you need from that agency?
Yeah, we're getting the support we need. Again, I told you we've TDY'd staff into Yuma, or temporary detailed staff to Yuma to assist when needed. We've effectively cleared out the backlog of people waiting to come to ICE custody, but every day CBP arrests more and more people, so we continue to monitor that. And when those people are ready to be transferred to ICE, they will be. My leadership is supportive of our needs and get us what we need.
Are you frustrated that you're seeing a
I've been
larger
doing
number?
this job for over 21 years. I've seen it ebb and flow. I'm not frustrated. My staff's not frustrated. We continue to do our jobs very professionally.
Anything else that you wanted to share about this issue and its intensified light that it now sits under?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
I'm Bob McClay. Here's our top story.